Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, Vice President of Product Strategy here at Zimperium. I'd like to welcome you all to another webinar. We're looking forward to having a conversation and kind of getting some thoughts out on this particular category. Before I dive in, all the usual perfunctory stuff. If you have any questions at all, including anything technically about the session, please throw it in the Q&A section, the Q&A capabilities. We've pretty much turned off the chat capabilities because we kept having problems with it. So please use the Q&A section. There will be an archived version of this up on our site within a day or so. And then we can make slides available to anybody that happens to want that. So with that, we're going to dive into a new old topic. And what I mean by new old topic is the whole BYOD thing seems to have been around for quite some time. It kind of ebbs and tides, but it's definitely gaining some momentum. In particular, some specific vertical markets. We continue to get asked about it, so we decided to have a little fun and talk about BYOS. How do you bring security when your employees bring their devices? So before we dive into the approaches, we actually sponsor a mobile security report with the LinkedIn cybersecurity group every single year. And some of them had to do with BYOD, so I thought it'd be good just to kind of frame up why does anybody care in the first place, and what are some of the things we need to factor in when we start thinking about security approaches. So first one is kind of an obvious one, but it's also interesting to see how things change a little bit over time. What are the main benefits of BYOD for your company? Well, not surprisingly, employee mobility and productivity, greater satisfaction. What's interesting is reduced cost. When BYOD first started, because like I said, it's a new old topic, reduced cost was this big claim. It's like, oh, it's gonna be awesome. We're gonna have the employees have to pay for their own devices. It's gonna significantly reduce all of our costs. Well, especially with the cost of Android devices, which quite often are used a lot in BYOD scenarios, especially for the rank and file, it really hasn't made that much of a difference because you still have to deal with the management and the approach that you're going to be taking. But it really is all about productivity. It's all about, and also probably, to the satisfaction point, it's almost kind of become a prerequisite. What do you mean you don't allow people to use tablets or use their phones to access email and stuff? That's ridiculous. I might go someplace else, right? So what are the inhibitors to adoption? And this again comes from a survey of thousands of LinkedIn information security professionals. So I guess it's a little bit self-fulfilling. Information security concerns was number one. What I think was interesting is that privacy concerns were a relatively low number. My personal opinion on this is, as we've been seeing this evolution of the market, there's two different groups, and this is going to factor through this entire presentation. There's two different groups that are involved. There's a mobility team, predominantly IT, and there's security folks, right? Up until 2018, the vast majority of all mobile projects and mobile security projects were led by the mobile team, not the security team. Security guys were focused elsewhere. Now, they've all started realizing an endpoint is an endpoint is an endpoint. So the security guys in 2018, even according to Gartner, now own the majority of these. So I think part of the reason why the privacy thing didn't come up for the security guys is because they're not the ones who've had to deal with it. The mobile team has, because I can tell you as a fact that privacy concerns have been a factor, a major factor in how do we handle BYOD as we go forward. So how would it change on that point if IT couldn't view or alter any personal data on the device? Again, this is coming from the security guys, but even the security guys said, over 50% of them said, yeah, of course it would increase. So they were recognizing the fact that privacy is still very much of a concern for the end users. But then we asked them one last question before we dive into the things. What are the main concerns that you've got related to BYOD? So again, the whole concept is JT's bringing his iPad to work and he wants to be able to plug in, right? Data leakage and loss by far number one, right? I mean, what happens if when that employee is gone, it's his tablet. how do I make sure I get my data off of that tablet, right? Or what happens if he loses it, you know? That leads to things like unauthorized access, of course. One of the biggest differences in mobile from traditional endpoints is the user is the admin. And so that point about users downloading content, it's also the malware, it's also vulnerability because the user is the one who decides when he's going to update. So all of these things basically really have to do with the fact that how do I protect my company from the user, their decisions they make, potentially losing the device, potentially leaving the enterprise? How do I balance these things, right? So as we start looking at the BYOD security options, again, BYOS or BYOD, that whole concept of how do I deal with this continuum? On the one hand, the users are saying, this is my device. You shouldn't be able to see things. You shouldn't be able to access things. How do I know you can't see all my photos? How do I know you can't see my personal emails? But the enterprise, on the other hand, is saying, what happens if you click on a phishing link in your personal email that leads to a compromise in my company? So you're having these balances. And Mobile Iron, obviously well-known UEM, EMM, MDM, you kind of go through the alphabet soup of the evolution of that. Mobile Iron's a big partner of ours. We've actually done some really unique stuff with Mobile Iron. They have this risk tolerance kind of scale in a very good white paper that they've got. You can grab off their website. And I just think it's one of two ways of kind of looking at it, but the two approaches, this one and then Gartner would be the next one. Fundamentally, it's the same basic idea of how defensive to how aggressive do we want to get as a function of risk, right? If we're locked down, we're not really sure we want to do anything with this BYOD stuff. We're going to really limit down the number of devices so that we can make sure we've got some good policies. We're going to lock down what you can really get to, maybe just email and calendar. On the opposite extreme, Wild Wild West, you're like, let's go for it. Yeah, use any device you want, and go out, access whatever you want, blah, 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 blah. So it's a different structure, and that's that constant tension in BYOD between these two different extremes. Gartner has this thing called the Managed Diversity Model. I put down there below here the actual document that you can go snag, and it's a very good document. And again, similar to the Mobile Iron one, it basically says, here's this model of if it's 100% organization owned versus 100% user owned, who has responsibility, what kind of choices do we have, and how do we handle security support and cost across those elements? One of the things they have in there is a more granular kind of a snapshot here that says, here's something to think about. If IT owns it versus BYOD, what are my choices? Who's got responsibility? It's just another starting point upon which you can make your decisions as to what you do. But that fundamental tension between how secure can I make sure the enterprise is versus how flexible and how confident can I make the users that we're not accessing personal data that doesn't have anything to do with it. That's the tension that we're going to be kind of wrestling with here a little bit. I think it's really, really important, critical to note that there are two different, related, but different disciplines and capabilities that are required in order to secure a BYOD environment. There's management infrastructure and there's risk and threat detection, because those are two different buckets. We really, go back again to the Gartner speak. Right now, a lot of the management falls into things like UEM. We'll talk a little bit about CASB. We'll talk, and variations of UEM, which we're going to be talking about, Unified Endpoint Management, which was EMM, Enterprise Mobility Management. The risk and threat detection is mobile threat defense, is the Gartner term for it. And they're two different related things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the management options first, talking pros and cons a little bit, and then especially as it pertains to that tension, once again, between corporation and user. Because for certain instances, certain groups, certain scenarios, you could use any of the following that I'm talking about. But this again is to manage and to provide some remediation capabilities. Then we're going to come back and talk about threat detection and how the two of them have to work together. Okay, so broadly, there's a zillion different variations of these themes, but broadly, we can manage the entire device, we can manage specific apps, or, and this is becoming a much more prevalent, and we're going to talk about a specific use case, creating an enterprise container, where in that case, we're not actually managing the entire device, but we've got access and ability within our container. So I'm just going to kind of run through these at a high level, because it's not really intended to say, hey, you should go do this one, you should go do that one. It's really getting the thought process going of going, hey, I wonder what direction we should go for certain use cases, right? First one that we all know quite well, MDM, mobile device management. You're able to manage the device itself. You're able to do things like ensure the device is encrypted, that there's a PIN code set, that it hasn't been jailbroken from a rudimentary jailbroken capacity. This is the one that basically we manage the device. This is the one that a lot of users have had concerns about. And part of the reason that users have had concerns about it is not necessarily just that, you know, to be honest, I haven't even heard of a single example of where a company has actually, you know, taken full advantage of the fact they could see everything on this device. But that's always been the concern. And when you go to install an MDM profile on your device, the message that is given to you by either Apple or Google is ominous. I mean, it basically says the company can see everything, the company can wipe your device, the company can terminate all your access, blah, blah, blah. Whether or not the company ever does that's totally irrelevant. Users just look at it and go, whoa, 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 hold up. A lot of users will say, this is my phone, this is my device, this is my tablet. I don't want you to have that kind of carte blanche responsibility. Now, if there are certain scenarios and if you can get users to buy into that, and we've got examples that I'll talk a little bit about where you can, you know, show them, look, here's our policies of what we do and don't do. Here's the data that we will not collect, whatever the case may be. It is obviously from your corporate standpoint, that will be the safest approach. And I'll explain why in a minute when I talk about the threat part, because obviously the risk here is what happens if they do something by installing a personal app that leads to a corporate compromise, right? If you control the device completely and the access and all the access to the corporate resources and you've got the ability to remediate things quickly, and you've got the ability to solve the problem if somebody leaves the organization, getting all the corporate data off and everything, there's huge benefits to it, obviously. But a lot of users are not comfortable with it. So another extreme, or you go in the opposite direction, I have had somebody ask me, well, what isn't one extreme just no management at all? I mean, just basically, and yes, but if there is any corporate data or access to any corporate resources on that device, and you don't have any visibility, management, security, and everything, first of all, you have no idea what's happening on that device. You have no idea if you're being attacked. And then secondarily, any kind of compliance mandates or anything, you're going to be in deep trouble because you just let the door open. So I don't even consider that a legitimate. As soon as you say you're doing BYOD, doing nothing is not legitimate. So on the one hand, control the entire device. On the other hand, well, let's deal with specific apps. And almost every UEM company has these variations in it, right? They have MDMs, they have MAMs, they have mobile content management, et cetera, et cetera. So this isn't a vendor-specific approach or anything. It's more of a philosophical approach. What am I going to do for certain groups of folks? So if there are certain apps that you want to control access to, then you can use a MAM. And basically, by being on kind of both sides of that equation, the MAM can protect the session and the information that's going across for that specific app. So in that case, if there's other things going on in that device and everything, all you're saying is I care about this app in the session and the data that's in this app, and we're going to keep everything contained in that world. This one, of course, is much easier to get users to buy into because you're saying, look, the only thing that we're caring about is we're protecting this particular app, right? A variation of that theme, which is increasing in greater and greater frequency, is the CASB approach, cloud access security brokers. If the apps are cloud-based apps, then another approach to being able to provide some flexibility and protection of this is to be able to control the access to those cloud apps via a CASB. So again, you're dealing with a specific app, you're not dealing with the whole device, which again makes it much easier for users to adopt. Then we come to this container concept, again, of the three big buckets. And the one that's getting a lot of attention right now, as it should, is the Android Enterprise, which used to be Android for Work, a billion years ago. It is come light years forward. And now I want to say it's everything from Android 6 forward. It used to be that every single manufacturer that was on Android could implement its APIs for doing any kind of management in a different capacity for the EMM companies to be able to tie into. The one that was most advanced in that, which I'll talk about in the next one, was Samsung. They jumped on it fast and hard, but it was totally fragmented. So as an administrator, you didn't know exactly what capabilities you're going to be able to get depending on the APIs of different Android devices. Well, Android Enterprise solidified all of that and said, we now have this cohesive set. And one of the benefits is you can create this concept called a work profile, and it's like a little briefcase that's in there. In that case, you're not having to manage the entire device. You're also not just managing an individual app and doing every app by itself. You actually have power and capability within that container. So what you're able to do is say, hey, BYOD person, you've got the personal side, you're going to knock yourself out, go, do whatever it is you do. But we've got ability to deal with only the apps that are in this work profile. If we determine that there's something that's risky or dangerous or anything, we can blow up, take all the data out, terminate access, whatever, that entire work profile until it's back into compliance, and we can put it back. But we haven't done anything to your personal stuff. We don't have any visibility into the rest of the things that are on your device. And so you're totally fine. It's again, balancing that whole thing about what you're convincing them about. Another variation of this whole approach is Samsung Knox, and truth in advertising, just like I was talking about Mobile Iron being our partner earlier, and of course all that kind of fun stuff. Samsung's an investor in Zimperium. We do some really unique stuff with Samsung. We like these guys a lot, but they created this concept called Samsung Knox to be the most secure version of Android and everything, where they were actually building security, and they've got really nice videos on their website that really talks about layering up security from the device all the way up. So almost, in some cases, it's, similar from the standpoint of Apple, where Apple controls the stack. In this case, on a Samsung phone, Samsung's controlling the stack from the device up. And there's all sorts of different features that you can do. Now, I didn't mention it on the Android Enterprise. One of the issues with Android Enterprise is it's Android, which is great because a huge chunk of the BYOD rank and file are people on less expensive Android devices. And by the way, going back to the need for that, the less expensive Android devices used to be the more fragmented one that didn't have these consistent APIs. Now they all have them, which is great. Here, of course, Samsung Knox is great. It's something else to consider if you're trying to control everything that's on that device, but it's only going to be Samsung devices. So if you do have non-Samsung Android, or if you have iOS, you would have to, again, have different group approaches to all of these things. So as I mentioned, there's the management component. I've got these different options, and I'm trying to float this balance of what we're trying to do to protect ourselves, but also ensure that the users understand that their privacy is being protected, the personal data is being protected, et cetera, to increase adoption so that we can actually increase productivity and morale and all the rest of that stuff, okay? I mentioned there was two parts, though. There's management, and there's risk and threat detection. Again, in Gartner speak, it's a lot of the UEM, CASB, all that in the first bucket, mobile threat defense in the second bucket. Why does it matter? Well, here's why it matters. I put this picture out here because it's one of the things that I like to. My father-in-law used to be involved in shipping, and I was always fascinated by big container ships and all the rest of that fun stuff. In mobile, all the apps are in their own little containers. Even when we're talking about things like Android Enterprise, it's in a container. If we're talking about MDMs, it's an app with an elevated privilege. But the fundamental point is they're all variations of a container because they're apps, right? If a bad guy owns the ship, they can do anything they want. Similarly, if the bad guy owns the device, they have the keys to the encryption. They can go across apps and do different things. They've got carte blanche ability. So if I did download on the personal side a malicious app, hypothetically, and it delivered an exploit to compromise a device, the ship is owned. If there was a network attack and they delivered an exploit, the ship is owned. And we've got all sorts of demos, and we've got all sorts of proof points of how that. So we need to know, are things happening? The cool part is mobile threat defense and UEMs work together. We detect things. Zimperium is a leader in mobile threat defense. When we detect something that changes the risk posture of that device, the UEM and all those various different flavors can take some really specific remediation actions. So the two need to work together, right? So what are the, first, 100% of our customers have been attacked. 100% of our customers across thousands of companies have been attacked. So when you get down to the fundamental point of, well, but are we even at risk? Yes, okay? Yes, you are, without question. And that's across every industry, okay? What are the attacks? Well, going from right to left, malicious apps, when this comes from billions of data points, I do the global threat reports all the time, billions of data points. Malicious apps, from a corporate standpoint, are not the major threat. They are predominantly fraud because they're untargeted. Then there's phishing attacks. And this is kind of going up towards, urgency, right? I mentioned Verizon said, that 90% of the breaches start with a phishing attack. Well, 2/3 of the emails are read on mobile. So as a function of that, I might be getting a phishing email as a consumer that I click on. The reason it's still untargeted, it's still not the primary threat in terms of how to get into a corporation. It's a secondary way to do it. But the minute you hit that web page, not only might you give up your credentials, it can capitalize and deliver an exploit to take over the device. But the next step up is the most important. Bad guys are bad guys, but they're very good at what they do. And the very first thing, if a bad guy is going after XYZ company, they're not going to drop an app in the App Store and pray that somebody from XYZ downloads it. That's not what they're going to do. What they're going to do, and it's been proven, they sit in a coffee shop someplace nearby, they put up a fake network, they do a man-in-the-middle attack, they compromise the device, they wait until they find somebody from XYZ, and then they compromise the device. They elevate privileges either with a malicious profile or an exploit that's specific to the OS level because, oh, by the way, go back to it, users are the admins, they don't update their devices because it slows things down or they just forget or whatever. So there's all these exploits that are publicly available for all these versions of these operating systems because they're not being updated. Fundamental point, the bad guys control the network, and 90% of the attacks start with that, according to our data. And again, Zimperium was built from the very beginning to protect enterprises. There's other folks that were starting in the consumer space where apps might matter a little bit more. We were designed to protect the enterprise and protect them against their devices being compromised and being persistent. Only way to do that with containerized mobile environments is to compromise the device. The primary way to do that, to make sure that it's targeted because they're good business people, is a network attack. So the consequence of that is your detection has to be on device. This is a quote from the Gartner Market Guide for Mobile Threat Defense by Denisio Zermelli and John Gerard, a couple of fantastic analysts for Gartner. And I mean that sincerely. I've known these guys for quite some time, so I can tell you that directly. Basically, the on-device agent provides a better likelihood of protection on a compromised network. What does this mean? If all of your detection is in the cloud, the first thing the bad guy is going to do is cut off access to your detection capability. There's no reason for him to allow himself to be detected. He owns the network, which means you have to do your detection on device. I joke sometimes that companies like BMW and Honda, and they're really engine companies, not just car companies, right? They have engines and they put it in a whole bunch of different things. Zimperium is an engine company. We have one engine, it's called Z9, and it can do zero-day detection on device. It is trained up in the lab, but then it's able to detect even previously unknown attacks, device network phishing, malicious apps on device. So even if the bad guy controls the network, we can protect and defend. Because we started with the fundamental premise that the bad guy was going to own the network. That's a specific element for us. Our engine can be rolled out in one of two ways. If you're trying to protect your device 100% of the time, or potentially the device of from a BYOD standpoint, we have a product called Zips. Think of it as next generation antivirus for mobile. It protects the device, the data, the access on that device 100% of the time. If, however, you have an app, a mobile app, we can actually have an SDK. We have an SDK called ZApp for in-app protection, where you can detect the same attacks, but it's part of that app. So in that case, you're not trying to protect device 100% of the time. What you're doing is you're protecting that app and the session that app has. So for instance, we go back to the MAM side of things. So, some MAM implementations where I'm doing, okay, I'm going to do mobile app management. Okay, drop the SDK in there too. Now I'm able to detect as a part of that environment. So even as you're starting to look at these different structures of what management approach am I going to take, you still fundamentally need to protect the boat. You need to know if these attacks are occurring against the boat. This is not designed to be a product pitch, so I'm just going to go through this quickly. Huge advantage of doing all your detection on device. Our management console is not tied in with the detection capability. So completely cloud agnostic, take your pick. If you want to go on-prem, knock yourself out. Behind the Z console is a capability called Z3A, which is advanced app analysis. There are apps that are risky from a security and privacy standpoint, but not malicious. As app developers go out and produce these apps, they basically are a bunch of Legos. And so an app developer is behind, they need access to, contacts. They go find a library and they throw it into their app without realizing, potentially, that library is sending traffic to a foreign country. Our app analysis can tell you whether or not that's happening with the apps in your environment. Then we tie in with the largest number of EMMs. We're the only ones who can do multiple EMMs in the same console. I mentioned earlier that we have a relationship with MobileIron. In their case, they actually took our SDK and put it directly into the MobileIron agent. So in that case, they were able to detect 100%, they have 100% coverage right off the bat of all of their EMM users, and they're able to detect and remediate on device without even going to the cloud. So it's pretty cool stuff. But we like working with all those guys, not only in the MDM piece, but in the MAM piece and other variations as well. And then we can take all of our data and put it into whatever SIM you want. We also have a strategic partnership with McAfee, helping drive their mVision mobile product for all McAfee customers. And then we have Splunk app in the Splunk App Store. Again, it's all part of being enterprise capable. I just want to spend one quick minute. I mentioned quite many times when I talk about the management part, so much of this stuff has to do with balancing the concern of the owner of this device, the employee, with what data are you taking off of our device, right? Our ability, I mentioned we have great forensics that go down to the SIM. There's a balance between how much data is going to be collected, forensics, for you to be able to do stuff, versus, again, privacy issues, right? So you can set these, and this just is a one little snapshot of some capability, some of the things you could choose to do, right? But what I'm showing you here is we have some pre-canned configurations within our system, one of which, this particular one, is the GDPR setting. For those folks that aren't familiar with it, that's the data protection standard in Europe. In that case, you really want to have no PII. even for employees. You don't want to have anything, right? So you can see that we're saying, okay, the only data we're going to get periodically is what network are they on. We're not going to do any location data, et cetera. And then we even obfuscate from here where we don't even know the name of the owner of the device. Only the MDM does, for instance, right? So the point is, even the threat detection piece needs to be able to match whatever privacy threshold or level you want to play with, to make sure that you're increasing adoption, increasing the ability for users to be satisfied, productive, et cetera, et cetera. An extreme example of this is Mayor de Blasio made an initiative last year called NYC Secure. This is in New York City, where he basically said, I think it's a civic right or civic responsibility to not only provide clean air, clean water, clean streets, but also safe cyber. And as a part of that, he wanted to offer to the 8.5 million residents and all the people that come to New York City a free mobile app that will able to detect all those device network phishing attacks that we talked about. But it was critical that no information would ever leave that device. So it's the ultimate extreme of the BYOD side of things. Even if you said, you know what, okay, look, this is what we want to do. We're going to enable BYOD. We know that we have to worry about whether or not these things are on bad Wi-Fi networks or if they did something dumb and downloaded an app or whatever the case, but we need some protection, but we're going to go extreme. We're going to say we're not going to take any data off these devices if that's the only way we can get users to be able to do it. So we can't even do a MAM, we can't do containers, you could do something like an NYC Secure. In this case, the folks are getting all that information, but it's up to the user. We'll notify the user, hey, you downloaded a malicious app, you should probably uninstall that. Or hey, you're on a dangerous network. We suggest getting off and waiting till you're on a new one, et cetera. It's just another example of how you can go all the way to the extreme. So the key takeaways of this whole thing: one, management and security are related, but different. And they're both needed. They're both needed and they work hand in hand. Protecting the personal information, obviously, key to adoption, and how you balance that, which model you play, strongly suggest, like I said, reading that white paper from Mobile Iron or checking out the Gartner document I mentioned earlier, the diversity model. The approaches are changing all the time. I hit on a few of them here. If we were to do this webinar in 3 or 4 months, CASB might be far more important. Samsung Knox might have done something to increase. There's all these. They're changing all the time, and so trying to find ways of being flexible with that, I think, is really key. And I mentioned, for instance, the multi-EMM capability. Almost every one of our customers has multiple EMMs, either because they inherited multiple EMMs or because they were moving from one to the other, or maybe one had a better MAM capability and the other had a better MDM capability. So needing to find ways of being flexible, I think, is key. Your devices are being attacked, and the majority of those attacks start with a network, which means you need to factor in, figure out how am I going to protect myself even when the bad guys control the network. So with that, thank you very much for your time. I will stop and see if we have any questions, and if not, then we'll get you out before the 30-minute mark. Okay, I do not see any questions. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody and hope you have yourselves a great day. And again, the archive will be up on the site very quickly. And if you would like requests of the slides, my email, in case anybody has any questions, is jt.keating, K-E-A-T-I-N-G, at Zimperium.com. We did have one question that came in just as I was finishing that up. Asking about trial versions. Absolutely. We are always looking to do proof of concepts and get versions out there so people can actually give this a shot. And yes, it is jt.keating at Zimperium.com. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Have yourself a great day.